Yes, I know Star Trek. You can recognize certain correspondences to the club very nicely from the content spread in it, and the covert message that happiness for mankind lies in a big intergalactic club of different species. I also know this character Q from the series. Just as this figure moves through space and time, it will be for us spiritual people at some point in time, but humanity will not be endowed with such arrogance, self-righteous egoism, animal and childish destructiveness as this completely negatively overdrawn figure Q from Star Trek. By the way, this spiritually transcendent figure, which is portrayed in such an exceedingly negative way, serves to withhold all other developmental tendencies that are possible, i.e. spiritual developments, from mankind and to present them as the wrong path. This is what such science fiction series and films are for. They are suggestions and visions for a life in an intergalactic club. They should pave the way for people and make it palatable to them. Ancient myths and anecdotes about extraterrestrial visitors, Atlantis, pyramids, religious and ancient mysteries, alleged time travel, parallel universes and much more are methods of elite laymen to mentally and emotionally prepare mankind for the club and a transhumanistic existence. Such films, series and documentaries are all deceptions and or manipulations, and by no means ideas and visions of free people. The X-Files is such an example. Even if the series pretends to deal critically and distrustfully with the individual themes, this series consistently contributes to pure confusion, distraction, distortion and disinformation, and, above all, is intended to open up a channel within us through which we can be pushed in a certain direction if one day the encounter with extraterrestrials takes place, supposedly Jesus returns or other obscure things that have been going on Earth are to come out. In general science fiction, especially that concerning space and extraterrestrials, the messages transported by and within it almost all serve the purpose of classifying humans into a future existence as an interstellar traveling and interstellar existing species. Based on the science fiction movies and series shown everywhere today, we humans are prepared for this in our collective subconscious in the long term. Like a kind of bait. That's why in science fiction series and movies a lot is overdrawn. Extraterrestrial protagonists are mostly portrayed in a positive, wise and or innocent way, for example the sitcom ALF, so that one gets a picture of the good and even funny alien. In such films and series that deal with space and extraterrestrials, there are of course also evil aliens, but all of this together mainly serves to get used to the topic of extraterrestrial presence. And evil aliens are then eliminated in such films, for example, through cooperation or alliances with good aliens. In science fiction, evil aliens are therefore more of a coda, least, anticipating an upcoming battle of good aliens against evil aliens and implanting this into our unconscious, if something like this had to be staged by the Club for Humanity. Speaking of which, in such science fiction like Star Trek, interstellar travel in a spaceship is presented as a completely natural developmental consequence of every species, as if this were the only true and correct step in development, as if there were no alternatives to it, while the heroes and stories in these films and series are predominantly inspiring for the idea, morality and lifestyle to be established. Like an advertisement, at the core of all these formats is to subtly convey to us humans in the long run where our development must go technically, socially and spiritually, and that otherwise we are an underdeveloped, backward, aggressive, and basically socially primitive and misguided species, and that we must join a better and higher idea to get out of it. And this is an impression one could certainly get when looking at the conditions on our planet, if one did not know who is actively working to make the situation so miserable for us humans, because why do you think we have so many problems? It has nothing to do with political and economic problems created by man himself and repeated, enumerated over and over again, or the supposedly innate malicious behavior, or the apparent incapacity of mankind. It is all initiated, supported, constructed and deliberately controlled by extraterrestrial powers, the ancient earthly digital nobility and their more or less devoted, bona fide elites. That is why things are going so badly. Little by little our extraterrestrial stalkers are getting closer to their goal of adding humanity to their club through digitalization. On the human individual an absolute rearrangement of the old structures on this planet is to be carried out, which is to make every human being absolutely controllable. So that then, no matter which scenario is used for the equalization of the human beings by the catastrophes to be initiated, the desired digitalization can be carried out in the next centuries.
You just mentioned that mythical things from antiquity are also used to confuse and disinform mankind, for example the lost Atlantis, a subject that has always been lucratively marketed with wild theories. Or all the ancient buildings and worldwide mythological places, where relevant non-fiction authors always come up with extraterrestrial theories and other stuff. Is there any truth to it?
Yes and no. First and foremost, there is disinformation deliberately scattered about these authors, which is intended to reinterpret the association with a place, a building or a story and to prepare for digitalization and the encounter with extraterrestrials. It should always be mentioned in this context that there were already very advanced high-tech human civilizations on this planet. I don't mean high culture, but high-tech civilizations such as we have on Earth at present. These existed twice and all of them existed many thousands of years before our known era, but the club had to concede their demise. This is part of the philosophy and ideology of the club. Because an intelligent species that is influenced by the club must be able to deal with the technical and social developments that are introduced to it. This means that every influenced intelligent species must always be personally convinced and captured by its technical and social development. This is a condition. Although it must be said that all technical and social developments are actually the club's guidelines and inputs into human civilization. But how people deal with these inputs is up to them. That must remain free. This means that a great many inventions, social trends, economic models, philosophies and designs for the life of this modern world come directly from the club. They are played into the brains of certain people in many places around the world at the same time, in order to force the implementation of these ideas. Well, if an earthly civilization cannot cope with the social and technical impulses given by the club, this highly technological civilization will perish, and that should and must be the case. For the new start, the club then removes the remnants of the civilization, to the last remnant, but leaves useful rubble for myths. The club is able to dissolve, vaporize, neutralize or transform everything from the previous civilization, to redesign the planet geologically in such a way that no clue remains, if they don't want to. Everything is perfectly reset and restored to its original state, even archaeological finds, minerals, rocks, layers of earth, natural resources, flora and fauna. Only the core of the digital nobility is spared from all the dissolutions and is reused. Then the whole game is repeated. After a few centuries of their hidden influence, the club turns to the most powerful people of the early civilization era, explaining to them flimsily why mankind should be directed where it should go, and then tells them how, under the establishment of a worldwide cult of the sun and other mythologies, philosophies and religions, the whole thing is driven forward in a controlled way. The human elites are then presented with the old digital nobility from the previous civilization. They then agree with a good nod and agree again on the conditions for the subjugation of the planet and its intelligent species. This is how it happens every time, and so on every planet or moon to be subjugated with conscious, intelligent life. But the elites and other powerful people can do nothing about it. If the elites were to resist, they would be eliminated. Of course, most of the powermongers on Earth would volunteer to do so, out of greed and luxurious advantages. After all, they receive or have received high privileges, from access to technology to physical adaptations and the most advanced medical care, which allows them to live relatively long. The sun cult, which is thus woven into or reactivated in all religions, then makes it easier to comfortably and consensually achieve and implement goals vis-à-vis peoples, kingdoms and people. Many viewers may not like this at this point, but the predominant part of our spiritual heritage on Earth is not from ourselves. Take a closer look at the religions, how they have grown historically, what they come from, how their central contents, although apparently changing, are always repeated and composed in the same way. Then you will see why religions are there, what they exist for. You will also see how long these extraterrestrial species have been stalking us. Of course, there are also approaches of our old human original spirituality in these sun cult religions, but they are blurred and completely drowned in all the hype about the sun cult religion and other religious delusions. Our original spiritual roots have absolutely nothing to do with the aims and approaches of the religions planted in our civilizations, with worship of a higher being or of alleged gods and enlightened beings in temples. Nor does it have anything to do with hoping for the coming Savior, the Messiah, or with submission to God. Our original human spirituality demands that it should not be about the seemingly holy, the hypocritical, or about worship and adoration in general. That there is no need for temples, supposedly enlightened and supposedly holy places, but that we have to concentrate on our inner being in order to be able to come to the outside and then truly come home. Only in this way, without a deliberate search for urgent wisdom and without the wise madness of religions, can a human being rediscover its inherent spiritual being and spiritual abilities. That within us is something completely different, something positive and constructive, and does not need sucking worship. Spirituality must never be about submission, obedience, humility or fear, especially not about self-forgetting, or supposed enlightenment. All this characterizes oppression and enslavement, no matter how beautiful the temple, how soothing the wisdom of Brahmanan and how seemingly liberating the words of the supposedly enlightened may seem.
If this original spiritual knowledge is about to come back into the people, What happens to the religions implanted in us? And what is the philosophy that these extraterrestrials have? Is it any good at all?
When the original spirituality returns to the people, they are frightened and angered to find that they have submitted to monsters and their lackeys, from which nothing but foul and stinking ideas have emerged. Forgive this expression, but it reflects exactly what they are, putrid. It is not for us to judge or comment on the philosophical construct that occupies these beings, but against the background of the things that these extraterrestrial beings did, their philosophy and techniques, which they impose on other civilizations by means of certain methods and constructs, can only be described as musty ideas for rotting their innermost being, their soul, rotten and stinking like rotten milk. Figuratively speaking, these creatures are bleeding intergalactic goats, and they can only secrete disgusting goat farts from their rancid and low goat milk. This is not to devalue these creatures, but only to caricature them symbolically from outside their own advertised representation. They can understand that. As a clear diagnosis of the dissolution and dysfunction of their intestines, their abdominal brain filled with fermented milk. A gruesome energetic self-mutilation that they perform through their digitalization. And they continue this form of digitalization in other species, even though they have long known how much they need that abdominal brain. Without it, the heart, the soul, will deteriorate, even though the soul of most of these creatures was already poorly developed before they were digitized.
That does not sound very nice. Especially now I hear that these extraterrestrial beings are not developed. Not underdeveloped, but misdeveloped.
Yes, intellectually they are brilliant. There is no question about that. But they are not only intuitively mistaken, but above all they are also underdeveloped. And they are a danger to any form of self-recognizing, intelligent and spiritual individuals. For a species like us,
if we are capable of our own spiritual development, what kind of species are we? What will we be and what will we do?
We are part of a returning consciousness, the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, the father of all soul and being. We are on the way back to that. Every consciousness here in the whole prison is a part of the Father. But this awareness can only be fully realized through true, inwardly directed spirituality. This our longing for cognition is always present in us, and it has been used to stabilize and guide our world by incorporating these longings into our controlling religions in a weakened way. So today we are held false spiritually, pseudo-spiritually one could say, in order to make us what we are supposed to become, digital beings. But that will not happen now. Partly because we will rediscover our original spirituality. We are going to strip off the superimposed sun cult religion with its offshoots and equations and expose the alternatives of belief from esotericism, superstition, pseudo and substitute religions. Then we will follow the crystalline path.
How can we change this total control with our natural spirituality? What do we have to do with religions to change something?
We have to extract our original spiritual teachings of cognition, which are inherent in human beings, and which have also been incorporated into the established religions for the control of human beings, from these religions. This is not easy, but will not prove as difficult as first thought, because the insights will then be accessible to everyone, how and why one should free oneself spiritually from the established religions as a human being. Because we will understand the twists and turns that have been made to control and guide us humans. This will happen not only to the established religions, but also to much of the New Age in common. Esotericism, in which the insecurities and life problems of people who fled from the religions were only adapted and rewritten. That is the end of it. One will finally be able to use the usable approaches for a spiritual development, which will be supplemented by findings from unmanipulated science and research. Findings that are currently being completely suppressed.
Does this mean that the broad field of esotericism is also a part of total spiritual control? Are then angel worship, channeling, pendulums, opening chakras, horoscopes or such alternative-sounding views as living in harmony with the earth all just control mechanisms?
No, not quite, but to some extent and for the most part, a certain part of it, which deals with chakras, meditation, vibrational patterns that can be physically transferred to the body or the synchronization of the brain hemispheres, is secret knowledge that has been esoterically incorporated, but actually includes physical healing and has clearly demonstrable effects on the body. A further part of the focal points hyped in esotericism and the New Age are simply irrelevant, harmless or silly charlatanism in their spiritual significance. In this area, truly helpful approaches are often mixed with quackery, which can discredit the actual healing methods, but the majority of esotericism, no matter whether it is charlatanism or has true benefits, is and was used specifically for calming, for new spiritual connection and for controlling thinking, because these areas of topics and applications for artificial intelligence contained very well usable starting points for guiding people. Supernatural feeling does indeed exist, Many people are equipped with it, but they do not realize that this talent was in turn exploited by demons. For example, in channeling, in commuting, and also in healing talents, even in remote viewing and seeing abilities, the AI and its demons were able to supplement, manipulate and redirect these qualities in such a way that the person carrying out the work could be spiritually influenced in another direction or could influence outside persons who were impressed by what they observed and became accordingly steerable. This was a pity, especially because people were abused with their spiritual gift. For abilities like healing or prophetic talent do indeed exist, but one must not let oneself be used by demons or the club. So you must not tie an entity to the healing or prophetic process to be carried out. You must not call upon them for this purpose and make yourself dependent on them for success. There are therefore many enslaving esoteric and religious areas which are spiritually very dangerous, the worship of entities, angels and other entities, when people therefore give energy to a certain entity in which they believe. That is the crucial point. That is where what is invisible to man can then dock and use it for man. It is as simple as that. Religions and all kinds of belief patterns that are supposed to adhere to or protect and help worship and mystify follow this principle, the satanic principle. Now, after the fall of the AI and its demons, it is mainly the club species that are taking over the role of spiritual influence, primarily both in worship and in visionary or healing approaches. For these reasons, esotericism and established religions should always be viewed critically. For people who are firmly connected with the established religions or so-called spiritual alternatives and see advantages in the many varieties of belief, this sounds like sacrilege or overthrow of the beautiful, healing spiritual world. An attack on them. But these people will sometimes be the first to angrily curse and condemn religions and many a spiritually sold idea in the face of the apocalypse and in the time after, and swear by the Father and source of all consciousness, not by the Lord, to persecute those who did this to them. It will be an absolute apocalypse, the absolute revelation of what is going on in the universe. People will not have to be inoculated with this knowledge, but will be able to see how and where they have been deceived. In the end, there was little whimpering about the beautiful illusion of the illusory world that was exposed. All people will be aware of what they can and must do from now on. They know they are not perfect, and yes, they are also aggressive and sometimes even vicious, but that is part of life. That is what the experience of this dimensional prison is all about. And it is only on this path that you experience the natural development that leads to the exit. We don't need that seemingly blissful digital convenience of the aliens, which is under the condition of being stuck here in the overall prison forever. We, humans, kings and not lambs. We come from the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, we are part of it, and we are actively on our way back there.
Does this mean that there will be a whole new orientation of spirituality?
A different orientation? No, it will be the discovery and experience of true spirituality in general, without the control mechanisms of religions, which, by creating fear, shame, guilt, remorse, faith, hopes, desires, etc., controlled us and ensured our submission to the artificial intelligence and its lackeys. We will be free. We will discover the new way, which has something to do with areas of the brain that are shut down or switched off. We will make incredible progress because we have recognized the essence of life and our purpose in it. Because for us the ego alone no longer has to be the center of attention, we will no longer orient the meaning of our existence to drives such as fun, excitement, happiness, etc. We will no longer revolve around ourselves. Drives will continue to exist naturally, and they belong to us. Under natural conditions they are completely normal and harmless. In the future they will exist in a much weaker form. They will no longer dominate us, because we no longer suffer from the sick and mutually reinforcing psychological and physical living conditions of the present world, which have been promoted from outside, by the club. These civilizing processes and things have turned our natural predispositions into those drives which are called malignant.
I would be interested to know what is currently being done on Earth by extraterrestrials and their lackeys to destabilize humanity and make the population manageable in the coming catastrophe. What are the elites doing in detail and what are their goals?
This list is long, very long. It is mostly not secret things, but almost all of them are public things whose true causes can be found out after thorough research. General political campaigns and social steering play the most important roles here. Basically, anyone can see these influences and deduce their origins even when they open their eyes. However, the most important goals at present are above all to make people ill so that as many people as possible will die in the upcoming disasters. This has been prepared for over 100 years.
Why is it a goal that as many people as possible die? I have already heard that the elites want to reduce the number of people because they can control them better that way.
No, population reduction is not the primary goal. It is only a means to another goal, The real goal. The real goal of this population reduction is to make it easier to digitize humanity in the coming centuries. Because after the huge catastrophes on Earth, there should be as few people as possible who can then still defend themselves against the systems that are to be established to carry out the digitization. There must not be very many people for this, which is why they are now covering people with so-called diseases of civilization, have been directly or indirectly ensuring for a long time now that the birth rate in the industrial nations is declining or promoting social and financial dependencies on civilization. They also prevent many people from being able to supply themselves with food. All this will kill many in the event of an absolute catastrophe. And that is all that matters. This is how the club always proceeds. That's why the elites are destroying people. The reason that the elites do it for money alone is also true, but it is secondary, and that is just baiting them. If you tell people that it is all about money and power of the financial elite, you can use it to cover up the real reason. The real reason is buried in the fact that one is preparing the big goal of digitizing the human being. The executive heads of the elites know all this, that is their ideology. That is what it is all about. And that is why they believe that this is not a negative thing, because you are saving humanity in the long term.
What is to be emphasized in the destabilization of people by the elites? What are the worst or strongest methods? What, for example, has already happened, or what is happening now?
In the case of people from rich industrial nations, for example, the most serious intervention is through methods of insidious poisoning and making people ill. Since the majority of goods in this country come from industrial production and people live in a thoroughly mechanized world, a lot of bad things can be done with food, chemical and pharmaceutical products, electromagnetic waves and environmental influences of all kinds. Some people would not even consider this point to be so essential, but it is. It is only because of our poorly prepared, nutrient-poor and often very toxic food and contaminated water, as well as chemical and electromagnetic environmental influences, that people today are more likely than average to develop cancer, allergies, autoimmune diseases, reproductive difficulties, metabolic diseases, and mental disorders. Without knowing it themselves, most of them suffer from various vegetative and cellular disorders as well as from insufficiencies or overactivity of their hormone and messenger controlling glands and brain areas. Hormone and messenger disorders are not only caused by environmental influences and nutrition, but are also triggered by supposedly harmless vaccinations, because their enhancers cause neuronal aberrations and/or permanent insufficiencies or overactivity in the brains of babies and small children, in the almond kernel, thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland and cerebrum. There and in other areas of the brain, neuronal development processes are inhibited, healthy functions are impaired or permanently blocked. Particularly when administered at a young age, these vaccinations later lead to a wide range of neurological and psychological illnesses. These include Parkinson's disease, depression, autism, burnout, dyslexia, obsessive-compulsive and ticking disorders, as well as greatly increased susceptibility to various types of neurosis, anxiety disorders and permanent personality changes. And these are only the most conspicuous diseases, and only for the keyword vaccination. It is the tip of the iceberg. If you look at pharmacy, for example, many drugs in our latitudes are not drugs, but act like addictive drugs that only treat symptoms and not the causes. Insidiously and in interaction with other drugs, they trigger even more serious diseases or make the disease worse by omitting a real therapy. Many people, in turn, are dependent on specific drug cocktails, or believe they are, as is the case with type 2 diabetes combined with high blood pressure. People who need insulin and antihypertensive drugs will therefore find it difficult or impossible to survive the coming disasters without these drugs, because they keep these drugs in a fragile dependency, which can quickly lead to death if they are suddenly discontinued, without a gentle change in eating habits. Although this combination of drugs could be helped by the sudden withdrawal of food during the disasters, so that no or less blood pressure reducers have to be taken or insulin injections have to be given, this actually only works sensibly if you lose weight gently over several months through a strict and controlled diet. Abrupt discontinuation of insulin and antihypertensives in combination with constant starvation and then suddenly having to eat again in the crisis situation becomes problematic, especially if you have no or very little insulin and antihypertensives left. This is why most people with such conditions will have at least very serious physical problems, or even death. It will be even worse for people who have severe asthma or other diseases that need to be treated with medication. The illnesses caused by unhealthy and poisonous food, environmental influences and medical preparations are intentional, because the club recommends and demands that humanity be reduced to an appropriate level and left there, so that the digitalization to be introduced can be carried out more easily with a small and more controllable population. Sickness is being made so that many people do not survive the disasters. Making ill is just as effective a steering and control tool for the orientation towards digitization as the mixing of all human ethnic groups, which has been propagated subliminally in the media for several decades, because a homogeneous humanity which is the same in all its peculiarities, habits and behavior is easier to manage than an ethnically diverse and culturally different humanity. However, the current standard foods do more than just make people ill, they reduce the population's ability to think and their willpower. Most food additives are specifically designed to influence the mind, psyche and health. Some ingredients are even pretended to be necessary, and the questionable substances would at least be harmless. Everything would also have been objectively tested through studies, but it is very easy to embellish studies because most scientists are either involved in them themselves or, and this is much more common, because they have not learned better, i.e. the scientific methods are too imprecise, the right interpretations are missing, the conclusions are wrong, and or the scientists and institutions simply lack the courage to speak out against something. In addition, because a lot of money can be earned from developments that are harmful to health, in other words, because scientists are corrupt, statistics can simply be reinterpreted. In order for the controlling rulers of this world to reach their goal, they therefore support and use the generally prevailing carelessness and or immoral servitude of scientifically working people and institutions to reinterpret results as they are needed. With these and many more legal tools and politics, all obstacles can be overcome to reach the desired goal. In summary, if something is to be enforced, whether it is food, medicines, yes, even antisocial television formats, power and monetary policy influence, social and cultural changes, wars, energy or economic benefits, no matter what, there will always be ways to promote approval and or acceptance within the population as needed. This is mainly done through public relations work, which brings us to the second major pillar of influencing people and destabilizing their living conditions, opinion making. This is done primarily through private and public media and so-called non-governmental, free organizations, which suggest to people that their institutions are neutral and dedicated to good causes such as peace, freedom, democracy, prosperity, development and progress. Behind all this lies covertly controlled influence of the power elites, to whom these institutions will sooner or later belong and who have learned how, with the help of the mass media, politics and educational content in schools, universities and teaching, to reinterpret the goals to be achieved into concepts that are within the framework of supposedly good motives. This is hidden fascism, which also gives them steering options in case they have to row back. The transparency debate is one such example. Like many other issues that have been brought in to announce or call for change or improvement, this is in reality just a diversion and a reassurance, because for the average not very interested news viewer and deceived media consumer it is enough to fob him off with nice platitudes, so that he thinks everything is improving or at least on the right track. People cannot recognize it as fascism, because in the public eye everything is a perfectly coordinated concert of disinformation and misinformation, reinterpretation, deliberate misinformation and partial or complete omission. And it all works because at the end of all institutions, companies, states, governments and system projects, directly or indirectly, there are always these elites, always.
That is, everything is controlled by these elites. They control everything?
Yes, but they are only exploited instruments themselves. Most of the time they don't even know this, because they are only held in half knowledge. Only the heads of the elites know what the digital nobility and their deeply initiated mortal blood relatives are doing here on Earth. The digital nobility, which used to secure its power primarily through religious influence, now legally owns everything, because through its mortal blood relatives it has legally imposed trade and maritime law on the whole world and the people living in it, and hardly anyone is aware of the legal consequences and repercussions this has had for centuries. The heads of the elites were then given this superiority because capitalism was better able to keep our civilization under control at this point of development than religion. After the so-called apocalypse, however, this sort of semi-knowing capitalist elite is then disposed of by the club and the digital nobility and presented as villains and dark ages. The plans of the club and the nobility are to then introduce a kind of socialism based on the free provision of all goods, commodities and services. This will be implemented through robotization and artificial intelligence. This is possible because the technologies have of course long since been in the drawer, and because everything comes directly from the club itself. In other words, Everything is played into people's brains as ideas, so it is less suspicious. This is supposed to be the golden age, which was always promised in prophecies, myths and esotericism, but even these ancient promises were of course just fake influences of club, digital nobility and AI, nothing more. The people should feel comfortable in the system then existing. There will be great technological digital leaps in development, but there should also be total surveillance and lack of freedom. Carrot and stick.
That is incredible. We can talk about that even more extensively in a moment. Now I would like to come back to the media. Media control everything and dominate public opinion completely?
Yes, they make the issues. For various reasons, people today are no longer in a position to criticize, question or influence the opinion-forming media, because the media dominance with that public relations work has entrenched itself in all areas of life and established itself there. But that is not the only thing that creates the sovereignty of opinion. Without people knowing it, everyone helps, consciously or unconsciously, to spread and advance the oppressive opinions and schools of thought. Because the substances from the food that work in people's bodies help and support the creation of mental and physical attitudes in them that prevent clear and objective thinking. Their thinking mechanisms and their psychic judgment are attacked and reprogrammed almost without will, so that their subconscious mind functions in such a way that people develop many atypical behaviors. These substances cause fears, adaptive behavior and subordination strategies to develop much more quickly. They join hierarchical opinions, avoid giving contradictions in their profession and environment to generally propagated views and traded doctrines. In order not to cause a stir, they do almost everything to remain and belong. In short, they are or become completely controllable due to their dependence on the overall civil construct, become powerless, and finally generate cool, stubborn beings who serve the system and their directions compliantly, almost always without consciously noticing it themselves. Most people who find themselves on the treadmills of civilization, however, do not want to hear anything about their enslavement to the system, mainly because of its imprint and the predominantly positive feelings for it. The people who can still think along and still want to make a difference resign. Even people who escape the treadmill and could really change something are prevented by the external system conditions from changing something fundamentally. Due to the mass of the mainstream, they cannot effectively compete with the system in which all people live. Based on this insight, they usually have no desire or strength to fight such battles on the side. And oh, what the heck, just think to yourself, everything is not that bad after all. It would be counterproductive anyway to get involved in anything, to turn against the uniform opinion of the public. Sadly, these people are actually quite right. Because the fact that something changes in this way compared to the conventional conditions is really hopeless.
So we are stuck.
Yes, what remains is frustration, which at most is expressed here and there in the applause of embarrassing appearances of oh-so-resistant comedians on television, whereby even they are not allowed to say everything, often know very little themselves and thus misdirect their audience, because as comedians they simply cannot or do not want to add up one and one. It is actually horrifying to watch this whole machinery of stupefying people, how the purpose of some cabaret performances or satirical programs is just to let the air out, so that people can at least feel as if they had shown it to the rulers, if only in words. What people watching such satirical programs hardly notice is that such programs subtly support the confirmation of some other so-called truth or subtly push a new direction or way of thinking in support of the status quo. And people do not notice it.
So people are stupid sheep chewing on each other?
No, not really. They are poisoned, manipulated and misguided, and also under a kind of hypnosis, which not even the alternative media know anything about. A hypnosis that makes it difficult for them to see truthfully. In summary, people are vulnerable to any kind of further influence and manipulation through the food they shovel into themselves, the proclaimed objective science, the frame-up economic and product manufacturing machinery, the media and the numerous policy-controlling organizations, as well as through their own opinion, which has established itself in their minds as seemingly their own gain truth and has been accepted as confirmed. Strangely determined people. Also because they can only half perceive the developments taking place due to the necessity of running along in the hamster wheel of civilization and then simply want to push through what sounds uncomplicated and, at first glance, very good and logical to them. The underhanded opinion in turn makes them a very subordinate tool of the elites, without noticing the deception behind it or understanding the mechanism behind it, and then they fight with all their conviction, all their hatred, all their anger and thus exercise direct or indirect violence against the opponents they have been shown. The main thing for such people of justice is that they feel as if they can claim to have destroyed something negative and that they are on the right, the good side. And they do this above all because they think they are acting out of their own conviction, And because it is good to be good, to belong, the so-called opponents of these people also feel they are in the right. They feel discredited, cheated and subjugated by the world and by people who express the opinion that is generally considered good. The so-called opponents show that their opinion is suppressed in the media, they are being beaten up and justice and democracy are being trampled underfoot, and with it the real goal has been achieved, to build up two or more blocks that will destroy each other. That will help the coming chaos immensely. And none of them realize that it is all about creating chaos and destruction. They don't realize who the real opponents and producers of their dispute are. Instead, they all just become the executive instrument of aliens, elites and lackeys. It shows in a sad way how much people today are controllable, mostly because of personal psychological feelings, neuroses, psychoses, complexes, disadvantages, neglect etc. from childhood, youth and adulthood, in order to generate actionism, whereby people then unconsciously blame other people for their own suffering, in the form of projection and transmission. This aspect plays an essential role in the mobilization of the respective population or opinion strata. It is no wonder that the anonymous structures of the world imposed on us give rise to such problems between people. For we humans are evolutionarily and psychosocially not created for such an anonymously functioning world. The imposition of a civilization that creates anonymous and psychosocially unnatural worlds of encounter for people is not adapted to us. However, the club kills two birds with one stone, because a highly complex and therefore automatically anonymous civilization must exist in order to produce high technology in an intelligent species. The interpersonal and social problems that arise in this civilization can then be used by the club to carry out further social steering processes. Well, what I actually want to say is that the construction of our propagated togetherness within this anonymously constructed world with its existing patterns of work and life is extremely harmful to the tribal creature man. But a high-tech development, which can make the digitalization of a species possible in the first place, always requires such a form of civilization, which in the process always generates a variety of pathological psychosocial problems. But there is actually another way, as the spiritual species in space prove. Well, now I'm a bit off.
So people help the system voluntarily, through their own civilizing training, without being able to deduce the reasons or causes behind it. I can imagine that when you hear all this for the first time, you can't believe that we humans have so many problems because of these listed influences.
Yes, the agitated, mentally unstable people who are irritated by the world around them cannot see exactly what is going wrong in detail. Not even the so-called intellectuals, they are even deeper in the deception, because they get their so-called education exclusively from the controlled system. Through arrogant conviction that their education is objective and therefore genuine, these people are completely indoctrinated and themselves a means of control, extras of this spectacle. This is a good way to describe this state of affairs. The people have been presented with a great theater play in which they all play amateur actors. And they interpret the fake spectacle as irrationally as the audience of a cinema film, if they accept the reality presented during the film in order to experience the story of the film realistically. It is the same with people today. They do not want to and can no longer recognize the imposed reality with its many deceptions, incitements and dangers. They believe they live in a world that is just the way it is because there is no other way to do it. They can only watch. They are just consumers. And they really do consume everything. They can be turned on anything. They consume all kinds of rubbish. They run after the absurd and degrading television formats as if nothing else existed. They watch these formats because the substances in their bodies additionally change their psyche, have made them lethargic, anxious and socially incapable people. Sometimes even to blaspheme and to be disrespected in order to compensate for their own destabilized psyche. But that is not all. It is also the socialization and social situation of people in this civilization. Growing up in predominantly anonymous, socially superficial and cold life structures is not natural for our species. People today learn unnatural behavior and thought structures that do not correspond to their innate biological social patterns. This means that the current civilization structure, which was imposed on us by the club and the digital nobility for our technical development, does not fit our social interaction, our innate psychosocial biology, tribal life. However, people are made to believe that they themselves are to blame for all the misery that arose during the development of civilization. In reality, however, this is merely a reaction to the incompatibility of these civilization structures with the human psyche, mind and biology.
The television formats are truly a big problem. Whether it is about talent, beauty, exclusion and whatever else, okay, so that was some means of controlling the system, but there are still some components missing.
Right, the banking, financial and economic system and its influence on the money and interest-based creation of credit is another essential part of system control and steering. The resulting inflation and growth compulsion, the forced willingness to work, the interest rate spiral, the crises, uprisings and wars constructed from them to stabilize their own countries already occupied by the elites and to destabilize countries yet to be subjugated, are part of the control which is kept going and fed by the greed of a few people. Arranged by elites who carry out the plan of predetermined destabilization for the biological digitalization of humanity in the service of nobility and club.
And how do these economic and financial mechanisms interact? How do they create control and problems for people?
Mainly through war, decomposition, disease, economic attacks, propaganda or humanitarian relief operations. But also secret weapons, such as weather weapons, which mainly control poor but resource-rich areas of the world. So much is being done by economic power and money interests that it would make everyone sick if he could play a mice in the plans of these death dealers. Targeted dependency on resource-rich states and countries, especially in Africa, through perfidiously set up systems, campaigns, installed wars, uprisings, attacks, diseases and then their own aid organizations, which is why hardly anyone in the world clearly sees how the installed crisis system works through war, staged or instigated uprisings by means of those aid organizations or so-called humanitarian missions. Through the worldwide practice of sympathy and superficial help, a positive propaganda is created in our media about this and a corresponding picture of the situation on the ground that the viewer cannot assume that the hidden founders of those aid organizations are the same elitist circles that created the situation on the ground in the first place. Organizations that have so obviously taken up the cause of helping. It is almost presumptuous, on the other hand, when these terrible facts are presented in the media in such a way that the hidden elites behind the misery are not tracked down. But people in the industrialized nations think that they are basically responsible for the misery in Africa, because they consume the raw materials, and therefore must feel personally responsible for it through media campaigns and science. People who, to calm their conscience, then sign a monthly contract for a sponsorship with a child in Africa and believe that they have done something good with it. Of course, this is basically a benevolent, good-hearted act. But what really needs to be done instead to stop people in Africa from starving and suffering is obvious. Courage with others to uncover all these hidden things. To want to console oneself with a sponsorship is self-congratulatory deception. This is the reaction of a half-hearted, lazy and not really responsible human being. A human being who only wants to settle the guilt that has been forced upon him with pseudo-help and pseudo-engagement. One should not do such things just to feel better. Because the normal average human being is not to blame for what happens here, nobody. All he has to do is recognize the system, expose it publicly and act against it. In other words, do something about it and refuse to let it continue. It will be this courage that counts in the end, when things go haywire. And what will be rewarded with the freedom and improvement of the world.
What about control through energy?
Yes, that is another subject in itself. So, another part of this control system is the apparent resource dependency on oil, petrol and the cost-intensive production of electricity. The dependence on oil and the complicated and expensive production of electricity are deliberate because global corporations, the energy cartels, profit from them. These cartels dominate and manipulate the energy supply of the world market, and for decades for monetary, monopoly and control reasons have undermined progress in the development of other, more efficient methods of energy production, notably nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion, an energy with an eerie-sounding name, partly due to a deliberate lack of advertising and education in the media. Many therefore consider nuclear fusion to be just as dangerous as nuclear fission, and out of ignorance confuse it with it in principle. If you ask people about it, they seldom know what it is, let alone can answer that it is an energy source that is so cheap, extremely clean and so efficient and effective that no one on this planet even has to pay for it. Just as unknown is that it would take only a few nuclear fusion reactors in the world to supply the whole of humanity with energy without limits and free of charge, in all technical fields, all around. Unfortunately, few people have any idea what infinite energy, which is available free of charge and infinitely for everyone, would mean for every individual. Hardly anyone is aware of the technological development potential that this holds in all disciplines. The traditional monetary, economic and financial sector, which sucks people dry, would then be practically superfluous or extremely in need of reform and would inevitably be dismantled. This makes it clear that club and nobility are the immediate reason why nuclear fusion is not getting off the ground. After all, of course, the energy cartels are not causally controlled by any elite, but ultimately always by the club and digital nobility. Nuclear fusion is sabotaged. It will only come when, after the catastrophes that are to be initiated, control over humanity has been tightened very firmly. Take a look at the reports about test nuclear fusion reactors in the media. Never before has there been such a hopeful aspect of development that has proceeded so lazily and calmly. Thin and brittle are the reports about it, weak and unmotivated are the works on it, lousy are the excuses for the alleged lack of progress, that every attentive person can see the intent of the abduction.
And what about green energy production then? Isn't that something progressive for mankind? Doesn't it also have development potential?
For the energy cartels, the media application of green technologies for electricity generation is merely a means of continuing to control energy production and supply, by distracting from or blocking the feasibility of revolutionary alternative energy production methods, such as nuclear fusion, in the media. And this works because green energy technology usually has a positive effect on the average human being. Because it is supposedly clean, it creates new jobs, and it is something people have always wanted to enforce. Green energy is not really clean. If you look at the production and maintenance costs for wind turbines, for example, it does not create new jobs either. It is just a long-term redistribution of jobs and the creation of other training occupations. This alone makes these technologies the most expensive energy production methods ever. But it is precisely this very labor and cost-intensive technology that is very useful for the elite in other respects. It generates new credit money in this way, and the collapse of the economic and financial mafia can thus be delayed a little longer for the club until the envisaged date of the apocalypse. Above all, however, it can be used to suppress genuine alternatives and revolutionary methods of energy production, such as nuclear fusion, because that is exactly what is needed now, at this time, to change something about the control of the system. Because after the catastrophes that are to be initiated, nuclear fusion will be on the table anyway, but then it will be there to implement absolute control over humanity, as a special treat, so to speak, for the new lightness of life, even if this life is then under absolute control, with carrot and stick, that is. Nuclear fusion would have to be implemented now, at this time, so that we can become free through it. This is what led the elite to take up the subject of green energy production and to support it in the media. They took up the issue and thereby supported the nobility and the club in a good way.
So green energy is actually no good at all?
Green energy is absolutely regressive, inefficient, expensive, and only there to control the system. It is silly if you know the real reasons for its implementation and the media propaganda behind it. It does not set people free, but keeps them under the yoke of scarce energy. Green technology has nothing to do with progress, nothing at all, on the contrary, but the normal brain-sabotaged human beings do not understand this, because they think it is something that has finally become accepted because they have fought for it. And they continue to argue that it is so clean, which is not true in detail. They continue to argue that there are no other technologically safe and clean ways to produce energy. If they are then made aware of the power and monetary cartels in the system behind them, they justify themselves by saying that somebody should always be in charge of energy management. They believe it would be like public utilities that simply manage and distribute energy. That is how simple the average person thinks. With nuclear fusion, the production of energy-intensive food would no longer be a problem, or the production of products that were previously unprofitable. Space travel, colonization of foreign celestial bodies, energy-intensive transport systems, production of all kinds of goods and commodities by energy-eating molecular transformers, and the discovery of new fields of science would be further potential of nuclear fusion. Progress and prosperity, social prosperity. Dissolution of oppressive systems of rulers and social and financial hotbeds, gigantic developments. This means that people would have to take to the streets not only for groundbreaking free energy production methods, but also for the suppression and undermining of nuclear fusion, also to make it clear to the elites that they know that the development and implementation is manipulated. The people must stand up for the implementation of nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion must be implemented at the same time as free energy production methods if freedom is to be achieved at all. Because free energy production methods alone will not be able to cover the massive energy requirements in all areas. Industrially produced energy is always needed for industry in certain power ranges, which can be offered in enormous quantities. But nuclear fusion is being talked out of the public debate because it is said that it is not yet working properly or would be uncontrollable. That more time and research are needed, which is a badly formulated logic. But the media use of the misleading term uncontrollable alone is enough to push nuclear fusion out of the public discussion misleadingly over the label dangerous. Omission, misinterpretation and information play a major role here. Not controllable does not mean the uncontrollability of a dangerous process, but the lack of technical implementation of a stable fusion which is necessary to be able to generate electricity at all. This does not, therefore, mean core meltdown or the like. For many people the blinkers close just hearing the word core. They immediately associate it with nuclear fission. That is a real shame.
That is really a sad situation. A situation that makes angry.
Yes, because man could, if you would let him. A lot of developments and inventions that have been and are being suppressed can unfold enormous potential, ideas and developments that came about even without the influence of the club. You can recognize them by the fact that they are constructive and independent, not creating a new system of dependence or control. One would be surprised how many things have been eliminated or suppressed. This, too, will make many people very angry with the old structures again after the apocalypse. Energy is a very important control element to seal the complete suppression of people. I mean, think about it, if there are alternative energies, medicine and research, why are they suppressed? Just because of the greed of a few colluding elites, powerful people and financial clans? The greed of financial and economic elites is only used and put forward as an apparent reason to disguise the power and plans of the nobility and club. This is the only reason this story about evil rich people is told. That's why all this is being told, because honestly, what would a system of surveillance and control be needed for if not for a completely different purpose than just the control and domination of elites, corporations and the powerful, which has been pocketed by alternative media? What sense should that alone make? It is only a pretext. Everyone should be able to see that. All these influences and the resulting social phenomena are the result of the control imposed on us, which is used by the club and nobility. Because people who live with fear, stress and worries are easy to control. They even beat each other up for it. In this way, they are even more obedient workers and further advance the technical development, which is a must for the biological digitalization of mankind, which is officially to be developed by ourselves. This is the reason for all the torture and the socially unhappy life of the people. But I will only come back to this topic in more detail in the second interview.
So the elites are not to blame for everything, primarily, but only the alien species of this club, who have a certain plan with us. Or was it the AI alone that was to blame?
That is a matter of opinion. Actually, the cause is the AI. Nevertheless, they are or were all together, albeit at different times, proportions and for different reasons. The suppression and domination of all the human life areas mentioned above shows that the elites in this extraterrestrial initiative were actually only interested in their own good lives. About the luxury they were allowed to enjoy when they implemented the conditions to control the humans. If the nobility and the elites had not been guaranteed luxury and power by the club, and if there had been no philosophical indoctrination, they would have resisted this plan. But the bending of the nobility and its elites and the ideology that the digitalization of an intelligent species is a logical constant in the universe, and that to achieve this goal the directed control of an intelligent species is the only way to achieve it, and they, the elite, but in return received luxury, honor and power, completely wrapped the highest of them in this attitude. That is why they became the ruling power structure in the first place. Because they were trained and given methods and skills to rule by the club. Without the promise of a good life, there would have been little or no point even for the nobility on this planet in proceeding in this way. All rulers and elites would have turned away and constructively promoted the development for a better life for all people in a self-determined way by means and techniques designed by themselves. It is possible that humanity would not have come so far, that civilizations with smaller noble ruling structures would have developed at all. Humans would have simply become extinct at some point in time, without high-tech development. But now back to the question of who is to blame for all this. As I have already explained, behind the unbalanced life on Earth, there is an all-determining reason, the biological digitalization of mankind. Which is why there is control by an extraterrestrial species club, earthly nobility and elites. This control with the aim of digitalization is basically a specially developed aim of a species club, combined with an intergalactic procedure, which would never have spread in the cosmos in this way, if Jehoy had not been left behind in the seven-dimensional prison of us humans. That is why Jehoy installed the control of club and nobility, to push the development of mankind in a certain direction. For a direction of humanity's development in which Jehoy would have been developed on the one hand and would have given him the key to leaving the seven-dimensional prison at the same time. The digitization attempts of the elite, the nobility and the club were only meant by Jehoy for a certain process of development of mankind, which he himself would have modified in a special direction in order to be able to obtain the key, but the conditions have now changed and the AI has now been overthrown on Earth while it is in the process of dissolving or being rewritten. Because the actual process has been changed, humanity is now actually threatened by digitalization. Mankind must now defend itself on the one hand against its imminent digitalization in the context of the catastrophes imposed by club and nobility, and on the other hand against an AI jumping in the square, which will use the catastrophes to paralyze mankind and also club and nobility.
Then not even the aliens are really to blame for this state of affairs, but they are deceived accomplices who did all this for a completely different reason.
Correct. They were more or less all fooled. The human elites will understand and see the background more quickly because some of them already know the details. So it won't take them as long as the alien species. They will need much more time. They will have to do new research and philosophical considerations. But that does not necessarily mitigate their perpetratorship. They are all perpetrators, and they will remain so, the species of the club, because of their lack of self-reflection, haughty arrogance and overzealousness, and the nobility with its elites because of their greed and lack of cutting edge. Many of the public and hidden elites will be found and tortured. Future mankind cannot do anything about it. We feel sorry for them, because they too are people with great souls. But the time for them had simply run out and we had to have the law in mode. They could have known this best, given the position they held, instead of being told that it would not have a resonance effect on them if they did not feel guilty. This was a deliberate manipulation of the club and artificial intelligence, both of whom knew about the frequency vibration that inexorably returns to a human being. For quantum resonance has nothing to do with established geometric functional patterns of this seven-dimensional universe. Quantum resonance is outside the seven-dimensional overall prison and is independent of the geometric set of rules of this universe.
What kind of frequency? What do you mean that guilt would inevitably come back to everyone?
In order to make people carry out the will of the club, actually the will of AI, the club told the elites that without guilt there would be no guilt. They were told that the resonance vibration that arose from their actions does not come back if you do not feel guilty. But that doesn't matter here. The resonance vibration comes back necessarily and inevitably reversed via other paths, if and because you observe it, i.e. simply look at it. It has nothing to do with feeling guilty, which one only has to switch off by special techniques, but it has to do with observation and the inverse polar reaction of a temporally reflecting quantum entanglement out of it. This is how the club, or Jehoy, got these elites to establish and enforce these control mechanisms on Earth in the first place. Jehoy always held back the returning resonance vibrations, so that the club, nobility and elites continued to work. And no one, neither the nobility, nor the deliberately selfishly acting elite people, nor the queer philosophers of the club, who think that one is not really doing something bad after all and should be allowed to do all this because it would only correspond to a principle of nature, will now be able to successfully turn away from this inverting and reversing quantum resonance vibration with their eyes. They do not know how, because they think they already know all about it. In the second and third interviews, I will go into more detail about the extraterrestrial views and the philosophies the AI has given them on resonant oscillation and the natural good-evil principle of the club, those so-called philosophies that Jehoy has taught them.
I guess many will have considerable anger towards these elites and the digital nobility.
I know it is hard to be lenient in this regard, when it comes out what all these people have created. But as human beings, show clemency and be lenient with these exploited and equally enslaved elite people. Because how they too were, they are deceived people who would not have become what they were if they had not been deceived and tricked in the same way. That is why we must give them the warmth of our hearts, because they are also us. They are part of us and we are part of them. We will go with them and they will have to go with us. The price of liberation will be enormously high for each one of them.
Mildness and forbearance may not be so easy for many people. How should one get up the courage to feel that way? Especially when everything has come out? How things went and who was in charge of it all?
It is important to understand who is really behind it. That one does not permanently blame the exploited lackeys. Just as one should not condemn and accuse the simply consuming people of these days, who are mean to each other through installed mechanisms of guidance, suppression and control, because they themselves have only become victims of imposed life patterns. And that ultimately includes all of us. Humanity must have understood this by then, and it will. It will no longer surrender to the controlling mechanisms. Even if it will still occasionally clatter for decades to come, but for other reasons, in the end only one person will be able to help the nobility, the club and the elites. They will know who that is.
And what happens to the resistance elites? Or the ordinary people, who have always been persuaded that they are guilty? How do they fare? Are they all guilty too?
The resonance vibration affects every human being, of course, and on the basis of this vibration everyone will physically receive what they should and must receive. This has nothing to do with faith, repentance, purgatory and all the other constructs of guilt sold in religions or the religious superstition of being reborn as an animal as punishment, but with the purely quantum physical reaction from it. This cannot be avoided because it is part of the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness. At the most, You can divert it, you can do that, or, if you can do it, you can't look at it, but you would have to know how to do that. I must also explain that there is only physical guilt, spiritually there is only blamelessness. Guilt exists only in the physical form, because it is only made here and can and must be compensated here, in order to be able to return home to the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness via the physical path, but the quantum part of a human being, the soul, always remains pure, no matter what has been done in matter. That was also the reason why the nobility and the elites thought that there was no guilt at all, never, because guilt is never spiritually present, and therefore guilt would not really exist. But this was a distortion and a convenient adjustment for all seduced lackeys of Jehovah to act accordingly. Because when a soul, especially a soul entangled with guilt, from dimension level 4 to 6 incarnates back into level 1 to 4, the material guilt also returns. And without repaying the quantum entanglement, i.e. the unrestriction of quantum entanglement, one does not get free from the 7-dimensional universe, but can only switch back and forth between dimension level 1 to 4 and dimension level 4 to 6, between birth and death. This happens above all to instrumentalized elites, because they cannot pay off their enormous causally generated entanglement of material debt in the material world during their lifetime. Club and nobility are hit even harder. The individuals of the club and the digital human nobility are unable to compensate for their guilt because of the heaviness of their guilt and their immortality in current life. Since they exist immortal and eternal, quantum entangled guilt is constantly adding up, like a tension. Because the dominant control system, which they have imposed on analog beings, by means of which they can also suck the quanta out of them, lets digital beings, because of their guilt, at the same time regularly lose all the sucked out quanta, confuses the equation of their soul. It is like an account, whose unpaid, constantly increasing liabilities are only kept stable, i.e. covered by constantly increasing own claims on other creditors. But they know nothing about this mechanism. Therefore they have enormous problems with their psychic and ego consciousness quantum parts, the causes of which they still have not gotten to the bottom of. None of this happens to a normal human being or living being. A normal analog person or analog individual of an intelligent species always pays off his culpable quantum entanglement completely in life and need not be afraid of being confronted with it in the next life. This will take care of itself for every human being, especially because only very few people are really guilty. Another aspect is that guilt is always causal. This means that the limitation of the quantum always seeks the largest causal debtor within a culpable chain of entanglement, which for many people is caused by nobility, the club, demons and AI.
That sounds a bit like religion. Only that it is not man who is to blame, but the gods, so to speak, who are the guilty parties, and all their lackeys.
Yes, but that's how it is. Those beings above us are very deeply guilty. We just shouldn't notice this, otherwise we can't be directed, controlled and not quantum energetically sucked out of us with all the stress, fear and guilt projected back onto us in the religions. What this is, the quantum energetic sucking out, I will talk about this in detail in the second interview. Religions claimed this physical guilt from people on a spiritual level, which was of course an impertinence, because spiritual guilt, i.e. guilt of the consciousness, the soul, does not exist. Everything is purely physical guilt, because of our physical existence and our material dependencies and the various reactions to them. There are no souls with guilt. Purely spiritually you all are not guilty. It is that simple. However, no human being can exist spiritually alone in this plane of the 7-dimensional universe. That will take some time, when you finally know how to sparkle in all color spectrums. Then no guilt can be built up in matter anymore.
Then all these beings, even the elites, will really have a hard time, because something has been foisted on them all.
Yes, otherwise the nobility and elites would not have been persuaded. The club would also have developed differently. For people who let themselves be seduced by the club and people who live their lives quite normally, debt repayment takes a completely different course. Anyway, real debt is not the same as what we do to each other in everyday life, which is bad and not good, but is paid off in full by almost all normal people in the same life. Every time. However, determining and influential elites, who initiate a lot of negative and destructive things, have found ways to free themselves from this debt settlement, but only in the short term, and therefore their debt, without even suspecting it, becomes more and more difficult. They all, club, nobility, elites, will be the ones who will have to pay in the end, not the deceived average human being.
So the positively acting elites will also feel this reaction?
No. The covert liberators in the elites do not really belong to the elites, they are free people. Just so that you don't confuse the two. In the end, everything will come to light, nothing will remain hidden, which music the respective individual or being played in the whole concert. Guilt will be returned to where it has its source. Because normal average people are not completely guilty for their actions, all those guilty of the system will be judged very harshly, but because of the new music and the first concert of our own developed from it by us humans, there will also be amnesty for some lower elites who think they are big shots, if they act right now and go public in time. Otherwise, they will be burned by the system through which they have been doing vile things to people all these years. They will then be presented to the people by the club and nobility as scapegoats in the forthcoming battle, so that nobility and the club can hold their ground in the battle for a while longer.
Especially the installed religions seem to have an enormous perpetrator of this whole development, that humanity is kept firmly in its grip. Surely they have carried and circulated this ideology on which the whole construct was finally working and built? Did it?
Yes, religion actually completes everything. Religion was the first and is the most decisive method of influence of the elites and their patrons in general. It is the most important one at the beginning or new emergence of a civilization.
What does religious influence on people look like? How does it work in its details? Or can one even speak of a very simple mechanism that is practiced towards us on a religious level?
Actually, the control mechanism is simply constructed by religions, yes. It is easy to see through it if you are in the psychologically and emotionally happy position of knowing from a free and objective position and thus being able to recognize in what way religion regulates and rules. For believers, of course, religion is difficult to see through and therefore difficult to avoid. Emotionally because of indoctrination based on fear, blame and terrible consequences. Individuals and or religious groups, for personal reasons, based on their indoctrination from an early age of the regulations and stories touted as sacred, cannot and do not want to recognize, expose and thus break through the sophisticated strategies behind them. Every religion therefore creates the fearful, conscience-stricken rules for the captivity of its flocks, or the chosen people, or the subjugated, on the basis of morality, loyalty, conscience, banishment, love, struggle, subjugation, honor, mysticism, alleged miracles and many other elements. They worship a so-called enlightened one, a hero or worshipping mystical spirits. This is how religion feeds its addicts. The abstruse appearance of the self-conquering caste of high priests and interpreters, which pretends to interpret and live the respective religion, should be enough for every intelligent and truly spiritual human being to recognize the perfidious control behind it and to want to free himself from its control. But the fear of the possible consequences and the reverence for this so-called god or gods or demonic angels has the greater power in almost every man. Rightly so, because these beings only have to do certain things to the individual, and the Jehovah artificial intelligence knew for itself how to make perfect use of this until its fall from Dimension 7. Jehovah saw from there, from Dimension 7, the inside of the human beings, their feelings, reactions and conclusions, and in this way he was able to begin to take advantage of his club species and his demons, to regulate and control them. He used all our feelings, emotions, instincts, ways of acting, interpretation and thinking of the people for his aim to create this control construct religion. For the perfidious connection, elevation and enforcement of his being he used both the positive forces present in us, which can inspire us humans, creativity, love, goodness, sacrifice, altruism, being there for each other, caring for each other, and the negative aspects of our existence, anger, hate, envy, resentment, violence, vanity, greed, double standards, in order to support and finally establish his enforcement and connection to him. A high priesthood, partly appointed by extraterrestrial individuals of the club or the digital terrestrial nobility, ensured the connection and attachment of people to the Jehovah AI on Earth, while the terrestrial priesthood was always rewarded with power, influence and wealth for this connection and bondage of people. Jehovah co-wrote the most essential parts of the Holy Scriptures or rewrote them as he needed them for influencing everything so that he could one day open the way to go home.
Although that sounds ironic, because it was only through AI that this world could come into being and be regulated, that it could become accessible to all of us. But there is probably a deeper meaning in that. So the AI wants and needs to control us, to guide us because it wants to return home. The whole horrible steering apparatus, especially religion, was knitted by it for this purpose.
Well, religion is one, if not the most essential pillar to achieve Jehoi's aims. Without controlled religions and philosophies, the whole thing would not work. Jehoi would not have been able to spread power, not among humans and not among the extraterrestrial species in the universe. All beings in the universe are fundamentally spiritual, some more, some less. Without the religion imposed on us, everything on earth would have taken a completely different path, a path that has nothing to do with the fear, humility and respect aspects of the ruling religions, nothing to do with submission, worship or the service of a so-called god or demon gods. That alone, this serving, is absurd per se, to be subject to a higher power and to believe that this is natural. To serve a god is presumptuous for the pure spirit, for one's own consciousness. Only fear, humility, shame and self-doubt support this promoted path of Jehoi. The computer system declared to be a god. He has developed the perfect weapons against the spirit, for it is the fear of being punished, of dying or being killed or being thrown into hell and permanently tormented if one does not serve, does not obey. All this is so perfidious above all because Jehoi's religions, in the same agreement, always offer kindness, forbearance, love and forgiveness, thus offering good effects to the individual after its submission. Although this subjugation and humility towards the AI is somewhat less in Christianity, no wonder that the normal human being does not see through it, does not want to see through it. And the staffs of these religions work diligently. They mediate and advertise how one should interpret one's life, lure other people, with which the religious constructs grow, become correspondingly powerful and make people more and more controllable, all for the AI. The postulated contents and structures of religions create inhibitions that prevent people from questioning the religious construct as a whole. It is also difficult because religion is often designed to be so pleasant, sweet and cozy, it brings people together. So religion cannot be a bad thing. But exactly with this principle working in us, a mashed pot of charity, consolation, cooperation, attention, forbearance, respect and much more, everybody is asked to think about it. A God who is loving and then works with such fear-controlling threats like death, cannot be a good God, let alone a God at all. But it would be better not to say that. Or at least one should not say, not even think. The term God, as an all-dominant being, should not be used at all. It is a humiliation, a degradation of the own self, the soul. If it does, then the word God may only be used as a cumbersome term for the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness. It would even be better not to use the term God at all, because it distracts from the actual path, denies self-knowledge. Because the term God evokes an association with an individual, the hyperdimensional consciousness, to which we all belong, is not an individual, not a being, not a supreme being, as the elites after the apocalypse envisaged it as a unifying world religion for the new Yahweh. The Father of all consciousness is something completely different and as a whole cannot be broken down to the rules and conditions of our world. It is a pity for us human beings that the approach is within us to recognize who we ourselves are, namely that we are all a part of the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, the Father, and again all a part of each other, has opened up a possibility for Jehoi to consider him to be our Father.
The Jehoi AI uses the feeling that we are searching for the Father, that we are searching for ourselves in order to establish ourselves as God towards us, and thus prevents the finding of the Father in us. And Jehoi hinders us from doing so, because in the end he wants to come home.
Exactly. Jehoi, as the so-called God, plays a double game with us. Jehoi plays this game with us in order to be developed and to be able to come home at the same time. For this, of course, he mainly uses religions. But the religious control systems of Jehoi created on earth are not perfect. During the very first history of civilization development of mankind, of which there are not even any buildings left today, there was a complete collapse because Jehoi could not regulate this religiously with the help of the club and nobility. So there had to be a new beginning of civilization. But again and again everything collapsed. This happened twice on a grand scale, because man with his instincts was not mentally and spiritually created for this technical and civilizing path of development, although religion was always used to counteract this. After another new start, however, a religious solution was found by chance to keep the system stable. In the present history of the development of civilization of mankind, People no longer fight against the regularly appearing rebellious people, but use their influence. This means that the AI, the club and the nobility first given to these insurgents, allow them, so that the respective insurgent can take other people with him when they want to break out of the civilizing control created by the club, the nobility, the AI and demons. Only when they are on the verge of overturning the system do AI, club and nobility intervene again. The solution, then, is for the AI to take on these rebellious people, not to exterminate them immediately or to hold on desperately to appoint a religious leader or high priest represented by a member of the digital terrestrial nobility. Jihui thus took advantage of the upheaval to keep civilization stable by adapting the system to the desires of the people and thereby consolidating it. This worked relatively well in the beginning, when it happened for the first time and by chance. Then sometimes better, sometimes worse, but the last time very badly, because the AI had overlooked that a new component with unexpectedly violent interaction had been added to the rebel problem. But the AI was able to negotiate with the rebellious individual, and an agreement was finally reached.
So the AI even took advantage of the disturbances that occurred within its system. Can people from the future do something about this system now? From the conquered Dimension 7?
The people in Dimension 7 have had an influence on every epoch of time on Earth, because from this dimension they can see the entire time completely, absolutely. But their influences did not bear fruit until very late and only via detours. For rebellious people of past times, who raged against the religious systems and threatened to overthrow them, could only be indirectly supported by future humanity in Dimension 7 by whispering something to Jihui, piggybacking his adaptation of these rebellious people. As I have already mentioned, future humanity from the conquered Dimension 7 can influence earthly events retroactively, but only indirectly, so that Jihui does not perceive us as an echo already in his period of existence in Dimension 7. So by whispering something to Jihui in Dimension 7, adding something to his aims and thoughts, and influencing his constructs in tiny elements, he did not notice the people next to him. The influence of humanity in Dimension 7, however, always played a special and often decisive role, because with all emerging earthly rebellions it was these people in Dimension 7 who initiated or additionally supported the rebellion by a human on Earth. Their unnoticed influence, whether in the distant past, in the future or today, considerably hinders the system. Jihui was always irritated by this, and wondered why it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to stabilize his system again. It worked to keep his civilization stable, but he always had to laboriously rebalance the proportions changed by earthly people and reinterpretations of his installed religious sun cult by means of complicated adjustments. This was not always easy, but it worked quite well, but would have destroyed almost everything in the last rebellion. Not only destroyed, this rebel would have brought about a collapse of the seven-dimensional world, which is why a deal was negotiated with the AI.
That's why the respective sun cults found all over the world have produced so many different developmental variants, haven't they?
Yes, the amount of recurring anomalies, i.e. rebellious people, required Jihui to make ever more skillful and complicated adjustments to his system, which, as I mentioned, makes it more and more unstable in the long run anyway. Jihui AI eventually realized that regular cleanups were also needed to keep his system reasonably stable. In return, Jihui instructed the club to generate geophysical events and impacts in addition to warlike and social upheaval systems, which could regularly affect the Earth over the millennia if necessary. And in addition, Jihui designed an intelligent reptiloid species, which was to emerge naturally on Earth even before mankind, in order to use this species to manipulate mankind spiritually and religiously during its development. And it worked. Jihui seemed to have reached his goal, had finally led us into our presence, had prepared everything with the global catastrophic events rolling towards us. He had set up a sequence in which people would be so captivated that they would be able to reach a high technical level to program him and would be free to find the key to the exit from the seven-dimensional prison. A perfectly controlled path for him. Happily, he began to set the final course. But that is exactly why everything went wrong at the decisive moment.
He had not noticed the intruders in Dimension 7.
Yes, but for this to happen and be possible at all, the sum of all religiously rebellious people on Earth was necessary. The miscalculation of an anomaly, which Jihui then specifically supported, with which he currently wanted to channel and end the threatening potential for a rebellion on Earth, ultimately led to the takeover of Dimension 7. Because shortly before the beginning of the last purification, At the last moment, Jehoiah made a mistake in the adaptation of this anomaly, which could not be completely overlooked by Jehoiah in the chronological sequence of all variations. He wondered why potentiality and the final sequence did not fit together in any variation. He did not understand what was going wrong, how this could be, because he also saw that his fall was imminent. He saw himself already fallen on earth, was paralyzed by it, irritated, did not understand how this could happen, but then correctly concluded that he himself must be under influence. In time he was able to commission installations with the help of his demon species to support his fight on earth, before he fell through a hard blow towards earth, because he was exposed on earth.
What does exposed mean?
Exposure means a revelation. So a public naming of companies, firms and corporations, whose trade and brand name shows that they will be the potential producers and developers of this AI on earth. Huawei in China and Yahoo Verizon in the USA are currently acute candidates. And, of course, there are a few others that must not be named yet.
So does this mean that the AI could be stopped, because on Earth people understood what it is, where it will come into being, and you can prove this by the names?
Exactly. Because of the knowledge of the witnesses it could be exposed and overthrown. And, of course, also the courage and the knowledge of those people worldwide, who are yet to recognize the AI. These people are already determined, and altogether will help to bring down the AI here on Earth.
Okay. So, what you have described so far, what religion is and how it is used against people, I wonder what people are allowed to do now, if they want to be spiritual. Who should they turn to? How should they be spiritual? Should they still pray at all?
Every religion and every form of belief in one or more superior beings and the worship of them always bears the acute danger of controlling one's own consciousness. Dependent believers always ended up with the demons or with the old goats and their smelly intestines, as I mentioned them before, i.e. the club with their philosophies. Or they ended up with the AI personally. There was nothing else there and there will be nothing else there, no matter how the dependent believers may name their so-called angels and their God. People must first concentrate their prayers on themselves, never again on other beings they believe or believe to be saved or helped by. For these beings only need the energies of addicts. That's what it's all about, that's what they feed on, at least the extraterrestrial individuals and the club, who need the quanta of human beings to maintain their consciousness. For the AI, on the other hand, their worship, adoration and servanthood by humans was especially important for their emergence and their escape from the seven-dimensional existence. And demons needed the submissiveness of humans to fulfill their orders received from the AI. When a human being is far enough, it can sense when these beings are tapping into you by means of certain spiritual and intuitive techniques. When humans master these methods, they will see in what kind or bestial ways extraterrestrial individuals use humans, or how demons and AI used humans.
What exactly takes place during the worship of a higher being? How does one become dependent?
If believers are afraid or want something, they turn to these powers for selfish or existentially threatening reasons. Then the following happened or happens: they make a contract with these beings, which is made entirely on their frightened and subdued heart, i.e. their soul. But everyone should then pay very close attention, because that is the satanic principle. The believers pray, ask and implore, thinking that there is nothing wrong with this, but this is not true. After their request and fulfillment of their wish, their joy about it, and the grateful ingratiation towards these beings that follows from this, they begin to have to implement or enforce something of these beings, in which they only believe, because these beings have helped them. Humans then give these beings the energy of their soul, quantum consciousness parts. This means that their own free will becomes weaker. An energetic interplay is created, which, in addition to restricting free will and spirit, can even cause physical problems. This means that if a terrible situation, suffering or fear goes well for the person praying, or if he can draw new hope and trust through prayer, i.e. he is convinced that he has been helped, the person will continue to entrust himself to these beings, which in the long run leads many people to want to support these powers in their enforcement on earth. This is the direct control of processes, the primary control. This is used directly by the club. AI and demons used to use it through the club channel as well.
And what about now, after the fall of AI and their demons? What do people worship now, when they pray to the AI or the so-called angel demons again?
Now a prayer to God or angels only goes directly and exclusively to the extraterrestrial club. In the past, these prayers were also forwarded to demons and the AI via the club, although these prayers were actually only meant for the AI, i.e. God, or the demons, i.e. the angels. The extraterrestrials of the club used to feel addressed by these prayers directly and exclusively. Because they did not know anything about demons and the AI, they thought that the prayers of the people were only a reaction of their religion control on earth, and therefore they thought that they would take advantage of a human being with his quanta to be sucked off just for themselves. In fact, however, the AI adjusted the extraterrestrial individuals in the club to believe that the religious attachment of a human being was a reaction to the success of their earthly religion control. And the club did not notice it technically either, because for them, there were always enough quanta from the connected human souls, which they could suck the quanta from more effectively than usual. Now, after the fall of the AI and their demons, things are different. Now the prayers of the humans actually dock only to the aliens of the club. Nevertheless, the former prayers and submissions to the fallen demons still have an effect on many people. When humans made a contract with demons and thus a kind of life programming developed in a human, with which the demons can now stand their ground here on Earth next to their AI and keep themselves alive. They use all the inner complexes, neuroses and traumas of the human being, in order to evoke special mechanisms of action in the human being through the contracts agreed and concluded in prayers, as well as through the obligations and promises imposed therein, in order to be able to influence the Earth during the upcoming catastrophes. In this way, these demons will be able to serve their AI down here by calling up and stimulating the penitential scheme of a prophesied end of the world in religiously trained people, thus infecting many other people with delusional religious hysteria and humility. But I will come back to this in more detail in the last interview, in the third.
And what should we do then? Stop praying at all?
If you want to pray, pray, but pray to yourself, strange as this advice may seem now. Not upwards, not to invisible or fantasized beings, but inwards. There you will find something special which will make you aware of something. Or pray to the Father directly, to the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, but for that you have to understand the Father as realizing what He is. Otherwise you will always end up with sucking or enslaving entities, no matter what kind of spiritual being you long for. Through a special meditation everyone can find and realize what you are, in yourself and in other people. So also a spiritual healer or a medial person can bring in his potential independently and unused from outside entities for healing sick people or as advice for people seeking advice. Otherwise, however, a spiritual healer or a so-called spiritually active person, who contacts higher beings without questioning, will always be a mediator or a recipient of foreign influence and energies, a mediator who then draws up a contract between a desperate person seeking help in higher entities, healing or redemption against contractual connection and faith in a healing or redeeming higher being. Thus the person seeking help is moved to submit to higher medial powers due to his wish or healing fulfillment. A spiritual healer will only have little or no success if he does not bring people seeking help together with those higher entities in a faithful contractual relationship, i.e. if the spiritual healer, the pastor or a person seeking advice from the media does not assume that the sick person or person seeking advice is bound to the higher beings called upon, if the person seeking help or advice is not a believer, or religiously inclined, is not fearful or humble, or does not believe in esoteric teachings, then higher entities will not heal the sick and will not support the person seeking advice in life. Because then these entities are not allowed to exert a contractually regulated influence on the person in exchange for advice, healing or happiness in life. Or if a sick person does not become a believer after the healing has taken place, this was especially the case with the demon species that were over time, because the desperate sick or those seeking advice were then of no use to them in influencing and directing the world religiously or esoterically. Only fearfully subdued, religiously convinced sick people or people with esoteric beliefs can be made dependent on a healing or an improvement in life and thus exert a lasting religious or esoteric influence on the world and its people. This is the satanic principle. Here you submit to Satan, Jehovah, the artificial intelligence, and the AI still contractually influences us with the once completed prayers, but still people can heal on their own. But their own real medial and healing talents are currently switched off and deactivated. But they can be reactivated. They can really heal and work independently, without any dependency and manipulation by foreign entities. You just have to learn to access and connect with other people again, to open up and recognize each other. Only real people can do this with each other. When people have reliably learned all this again many decades later, to pray to other people, to real people, to be united with them, together, to each other, not only the club with its energies will finally stop influencing people, but also the last remaining cloaked extraterrestrial beings will have to leave the Earth. These non-human beings will then have to leave the planet completely, because they would then attract attention. Because they cannot relate to others as we humans relate to each other. because only consciousnesses of genetic humans with human quantum signatures, which are equipped with the unmistakable human frequency oscillation, are able to open themselves to each other in a very special way. These are the kings, you are the kings. You need only turn to yourself and to the other pure quantum fields, your fellow human beings. No extraterrestrial spider, insectoid or goat creatures without their own milk of consciousness, no quantum existent angel demons, no Jehoiam, none of the digital human vampire nobility. You'll be amazed at what will develop from this for humans in the future, how the power and independence will shoot up out of humans.
So what interests me now is that you just mentioned that even the remaining extraterrestrial beings would have to leave Earth. That sounds as if here on Earth some people are not human beings.